Hello and welcome back, everybody. This is part two of what you could call a mini series within the larger series that we are doing on philosophical liberalism. And today we are continuing our exploration of what is liberalism and what is freedom. Honestly, this concept is so clearly important to everything that we are about that it definitely deserved two sessions to really talk about both freedom in its broadest sense and also liberalism more specifically in the political context. So if you missed our last episode, you definitely want to go check that one out where we began with the discussion of freedom in the broadest sense in which that term is used by people, and then brought it back into the political context, looking at the history of liberalism, looking at America and American history, specifically within the context of the long global history of liberalism. And today we're going to pick up with that conversation, again, looking at what we consider to be the core important pillars of a liberal society. And then we're going to bring it back again to wider ideas about the meaning, the value, and the importance of freedom. But I'm excited to turn it over now to my co-founder, Chris, who is going to introduce us to even how we describe this in our own preamble, in our own statement about philosophical liberalism, and get this conversation started.
Great. Thanks, Joya, for that setup. And yeah, as Joya mentioned, if you read our statement, which is the guiding force for this entire series and our Substack, you'll see that right there in the opening, in our preamble, we set out, well, we define what we mean by philosophical liberalism, but within it, we set out what we share with other forms of liberalism by identifying four key pillars as we see it that have been the essential continuing thread through all of the political philosophy and history of liberalism, kind of capital L liberalism that we talked a lot about last week or in the last session's episode, that define it and differentiate it from other political philosophies. So I'll just read through the preamble again, and then we'll dive right into those four pillars because we thought that they merited by their definition and nature of being these pillars, they merited a kind of deeper dive discussion. So, as we had noted, we said philosophical liberalism, which is the ideal we're championing at 1776 forward, is a set of moral political ideas ultimately advocating a free society, and it shares with other forms of liberalism a focus on individual rights, the consent of the governed, political equality, and free enterprise. However, it grounds the needs for and benefits of that free society in a wider range philosophical view of human nature at our best, that is, a philosophy to maximize human flourishing and human greatness. And I think that whole preamble perfectly encapsulates what Joy just said is going to be kind of the structure of today's discussion, because we're going to talk about those four pillars first, but then we're going to move on to the ideal we're championing, which is philosophical liberalism, going beyond those four pillars to this wider conception of human flourishing and human greatness, for which freedom, in our view, and what we're going to advocate for, is the essential ingredient. So let's just talk through those four pillars. Just to recap them, we've got individual rights, and if we were rewriting this, I might even modify this. I know we've said it's somewhere between 90 and 95% good, but individual rights and individual liberty, I think they go together, and we can even talk through that nuance and distinction in a minute. The consent of the governed, political equality, and free enterprise. So I guess we can just start by kind of saying, what do we mean by these being kind of the four pillars? Um, I guess I can take it, Joy. I don't know if you wanted to start off on this question, but I thought it'd be a good question for us to start off here. Why these four, and why are they kind of at least if they're not the essential four, the four that we're highlighting for our purposes?
Sure. So let's do this overview first. And then I am excited because when I think of individual rights, I think of it synonymously with individual liberties. But I guess you have a distinction and nuance. So I'm going to be really curious to hear how you think about that. But let's talk about the
Yeah.
overview first and why we need these four. And I want to point out here that I think one of the points that we ought to make explicit that we haven't made explicit yet is that our version of freedom is not the same as anarchism. And I think this discussion proves exactly why that is the case, because we see that there are certain structures that a society ought to put in place in order to maximize freedom for all of the individuals who make up the society. And I think these pillars are those core essential structures that allow us to have a functioning free society. These are pillars that were established in the classical liberal tradition, as we discussed even in our last session, looking back to that Enlightenment era and thinkers like John Locke and John Stuart Mill, that and obviously the founding fathers as well. These are core ideas that were established, or at least tried to be established at that time, that we recognize as being essential, and also that they're important to build upon. And the way that I see it is that without these four, you don't really have a liberal society. And with these four, that what you have, these might not be, I see them as being, let's say, like necessary but not sufficient. We might not have captured everything that might be necessary for a fully functioning free society. But if you have these four, that what you have is going to look a lot like what we mean by liberalism, and you will have a good foundation for a functioning, flourishing, I believe, liberal society. Did you want to add upon that?
Yeah, no, well said. I think that's a great point, and perhaps one we didn't really get to capture and touch upon last week. So I think that's a great place to start. And I mean, maybe to just even go right into the kind of individual liberty versus rights nuance. I don't think we have as much of a difference as I might have suggested. I do kind of see them synonymously, but in my mind, individual rights are the bridge between the natural liberty that individuals, I think, need by nature,
Okay.
and within a social context, as you kind of noted. So all of this liberalism, as such, political philosophy of whatever form, is about how do we construct a good society, which means humans interacting with other humans. Um, and so we need, if we acknowledge that man needs freedom, well, many people can interpret that as freedom to do whatever you want, whenever you want, to whomever you want. But that obviously runs immediately into conflict and contradiction, or it could, if, taken out of context when you start interacting with other people who have the same freedom. So individual rights is kind of the it's the legal and political concept that we construct to preserve man's natural freedom that he requires within a social context. And I guess I would just say, like, to me, that's the first and most essential pillar, because it really speaks to kind of this metaphysical reality and identification of human nature, which is that we are beings of mind and body, of reason, consciousness, and action. And we need to use our minds to discover the world, learn about it, understand it, so that we can then act to further our lives, to survive in the world. But we're not given a guide or a rule book at the start of how to do that properly, and we're not all knowing and infallible. So the only way that we can learn about the world and then take actions and figure out which actions lead us to survive and thrive is by experimenting, by trialing and erring, by acting even when we don't know, which requires freedom. So that to me is the essential aspect that liberalism, I think, well, not I think that that even in history, that really kind of grounded that fundamental recognition of the sanctity and primacy of the individual. And we talked a lot about the history of liberalism last week, but you know, until ancient Greek civilization, which was only 2,500 years ago, that concept was basically non-existent in man's mind. Men were essentially slaves, the predator-prey model, which we'll talk more about in the future. But with ancient Greece, we finally started to get the nascent outlines of this understanding of man, the individual. But then it took another, 2,000 years essentially until the age of reason and enlightenment in the 16th, 17th, in the 17th and 18th centuries to really codify that into a political philosophy and then also marry that with the social aspect of our natures, which is that we have to live among other people and that we are better off when we do, but that we need to then preserve man's nature as an individual who requires freedom to live and act in a social context where how do you then deal with other men who require that same freedom? And so that is where the individual rights concept comes in. But it is so I wouldn't say it's synonymous with individual liberty, but it's a mirroring kind of concept or construct that logically follows from it. And then I think the other three pillars I would say are further logical implications and just derivatives of this fundamental premise about human nature. So I'll stop there and see what you have to say.
Well, let me ask you a question because when I use the phrase individual rights, I'm
Yeah.
thinking of the Declaration as it's stated and as it ought to be stated, which are the rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. That's to me the core that I'm thinking of. But it
Yes.
sounds like when you're including on individual liberties, you're adding to that, or am I misunderstanding you?
No, I think that's right. You know, but the I guess the right to life, liberty. And this is where I mean we're getting a little semantic here, but this is where rights as a concept really only is relevant in a social context, right? Because man on an island has his life and his liberty and can pursue his happiness unimpeded, right? And uninterrupted. Even last week, we talked about freedom in the broadest sense being a feeling of freedom from constraint or oppression or any kind of compression. Well, again, in most contexts, a man on an island doesn't really have any of those constraints. So in a sense, he kind of in his natural state would be free to his life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So when the Declaration said the right to those things, I think the founders were correctly grounding this reality of human nature with this other reality that it needs to work in a social context with other humans who have those same needs.
Absolutely. Well, I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion then when we have, I think in our queue somewhere, we have a session all about what is rights. And then I'm really going to
Yeah,
look forward
that's a
to how
good
we're
one.
going to untangle that. But I think, and you're just getting to one of the other, we talked about the importance of, we talk about the both ands, about having, mind and body, reason and emotion, thought and action. Here we're talking definitely about freedom and structure, but then perhaps most important and the grounding one, which I guess you're getting at here, is that we are both individual and social beings. Like even the construct of imagining a person on a desert island, to me that's always such a far-fetched analogy. And as much as I love literature and I want to read Robinson Crusoe and I love the what's the Tom Hanks movie Castaway where
Castaway,
he's
yeah, great
trapped on the
movie.
desert island, but we have to remember that it really is a construct and that human beings, our very nature, we are social by nature. We come into existence only because a sperm and an egg from a social congress, you might call it, have to come together in order to create that individual. And then what we know even about human beings and human development is that we don't come into the world perhaps like amphibians or reptiles where we can just hatch from an egg and have everything instinct to us that we need to go out and survive in the world without parents. We are mammals, and the mammals links back to the idea that we literally survive off the milk of a mother's breast, that we need parents. And human beings have the longest development of any of the mammals, of any of the organisms that we know yet. So there is a real way in which we are literally deeply embedded social beings from
Mm,
birth. And then even as
mhm.
adults, as you're pointing out, we thrive best when we are in interaction with others. To your point that as individuals, none of us are omniscient or infallible, that we are always on this quest to find the truth and to build our values into the world, that we need feedback from others. We thrive with cooperation, collaboration. We're going to get to this when we get to why free enterprise is so important. So there is a way in which, as human beings, it's important to recognize that we are, the way I love to put this is, we are the most social of all the organisms and simultaneously the most individual of all the organisms. And we really need to respect that when we're thinking about how we're putting together a society of individuals. And that really is how I see what the project of liberalism is all about. And to your point that this is sort of the first pillar of the individual rights, or if you want to call them the rights and liberties.
Right. And and I'll just quote again from our own statement where we have the point on rights in Article 2, because I think it helps clarify. We say rights are moral principles that specify an individual's freedom of action in a socio-political context, the foundational of which of these are rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. So, I think that really encapsulates and captures this point here. Um, the only other point I would add, like I said, I think the other three kind of
Mhm.
follow from this, and I think most other liberal thinkers throughout history, once they started to kind of think through this in a coherent and targeted fashion, building a whole political philosophy and governing structure around it, came to the same conclusions, which is why these are the other three key pillars. But free enterprise is really the expression and extension of the principle of freedom of action. It's our freedom to, I mean, what is our action aimed at ultimately? To maintain and grow our life, to flourish. And how do we do that? By taking nature, shaping it, reshaping it, transforming it to create the goods and services we need, and trading with other people. As you mentioned, we come into the world in a social context, so everything we do and make is going to be vis-a-vis other people. So the freedom to make what we need and produce it, to trade it with others, and then to keep the product of those efforts, i.e., our property rights. That is, all of those are subsumed under the banner of free enterprise. And then consent of the governed and political equality just extends the notion that if we are all and need to be free by our nature, well, then we need to have a say in how we're governed. Um, to the extent we give away some of our freedoms and powers to a governing authority.
Well,
But
can I just, I would not say we give it away. We delegate. And I'm
delegate,
going
thank
to
you.
argue that
Okay,
that is a
good.
very
Yep, that's
important
fair.
distinction. We do not give them away. I'm not giving away anything to the government, but I will
Fair enough. I,
delegate.
I certainly don't see that
I
I
will
have either.
delegate.
And no one asked me for consent for a lot of this. So I'm with you there. Um, but that consent of the governed is that we have a say in it, and then political equality is that we all have an equal say in it because we all are fundamentally equal from a political perspective, in the rights that we are entitled to. I don't even like the word entitled to, because that implies like entitlement is a bad word, but that we have by right, by nature.
No, and as you say it, it strikes me how these emanate again from the way in which we are the most social and the most individual of all beings, and that this is what we recognize. As you're pointing out, that free enterprise, we're going to talk later about our vision of human beings as the creator trader, and so how free enterprise is the system by which we are creator traders, creator trader individuals in a society of other creator trader individuals. And then to your point, consent of the governed is what recognizes that as individuals and as full adults in the system, that we are self-sovereign and that we hold our own sovereignty, and so we only do delegate that to other institutions that are there to protect our rights. Uh, and then lastly, the idea of political equality is that we are all equal in our worth and dignity as individual human beings is what that idea of political equality is, as I see it, is all about. So I think, as you said, that these do just sort of emanate from that core pillar of the individual rights.
Yeah, and I think I liked what you said at the beginning that, any these are these are by no means the exhaustive list of all pillars. I think you used or to pick up off of the kind of architectural um, metaphor here. These four pillars are necessary. They may not be sufficient for full freedom. We certainly don't think they are, which is why we've created this entire new ideal of philosophical liberalism to go beyond the classical variant. But as we kind of alluded to in the prior session, without these four pillars, any other political movement or philosophy, whatever else it is, it's not liberalism. And I think that bears particular relevance in the American context because, on the one hand, given we talked a lot last week about how you can't separate economic freedom from political and civil liberties and other forms of freedom. And so, insofar as America was the most economically free country that has existed in history, which it has been, but it certainly was not full free enterprise at any point in its time, whether it's starting off with slavery or then, even once we got rid of that, then all the other constraints and restrictions that have been placed on economic activity since. Um, but it was still the most free. And insofar as it was, I think that speaks directly to why it has risen to the unparalleled heights as a nation it has. There's a direct correlation between economic liberty and material and other measures of well-being and progress in a society. And for that very reason, that's why we take inspiration in the American founding, even in our name of our organization, 1776. But because it was imperfect, we want to take it forward as well. And then I think it bears also relevance on the American context because insofar as liberalism, capital L liberalism, as it's understood in America today, essentially largely eschews or de-emphasizes the importance of free enterprise and economic freedom. I think we would argue that it's not really liberalism, whatever that is. So, that I guess those are just two other key points to note here on these four pillars.
I would agree, and the way I would see it is that the farther we drift away from these pillars, the farther we're drifting away from the core of liberalism. And clearly, to your point that that America is this shining example, and that we had a Declaration of Independence that proudly put forward the individual rights in our statement, although they did backpedal a little bit on property, unfortunately, because of the slavery issue. But you know, the importance of recognizing that slavery is a violation of individual rights. It's not what we mean by property, and that we actually need the correct view of property to have a flourishing economic freedom. But yet, still, as you pointed out, America was the most shining exemplar of economic freedom in the world. And we kind of perhaps showed the world what was possible in that way. And that, with our organization 1776 forward, we want to acknowledge the importance of that pivotal moment in 1776, which was the Declaration of Independence. It's also the Wealth of Nations. It is that core year in that era, Enlightenment era of classical liberalism, that we want to recognize and, most importantly, build from. So we obviously want to obviously get rid of what they had inherited from, obviously, slavery, racism, the way in which other populations like women or gays did not have all of their rights and liberties fully recognized and realized. We've been on the one, well, to a certain extent, we've been on a better trajectory on certain things, and we've been, unfortunately, on a diminishing trajectory in terms of others. It strikes me, and this could be a whole other conversation, but we've stressed the importance of political equality. Like, that's a phrase that you don't even hear I don't anyway, in our cultural zeitgeist. We hear a lot about people who argue for or complain about economic inequality, and they want something like economic equality, which to me is horrible. It's the exact opposite of free enterprise. It's the opposite of the economic dynamism I want. Like, my argument is always like, I don't even want the economic equality of myself at age 20. So, I want a vibrant life of economic equality over my own life, let alone amongst other people to have that flourishing dynamism. But yeah, we don't talk about the importance of political equality and what it means for every individual to be recognized as a political equal. And that's such a revolutionary concept, and one that we don't champion as much as we should. So I love how we're even just pointing out that these four are so important, and that it's a message that we ought to be stating more explicitly and bringing into the cultural dialogue more, as far as I'm concerned.
Here for that. And I think that provides a nice future pin for when we get to, it's going to be way down in our queue, but when we get to, because we are following along in the structure of our statement, when we get to essentially Article 3, which deals in proper governance structure, we can get into that very question more about what does political equality mean, and how can it be expressed in a governing structure. So that's going to be an exciting conversation that I really look forward to, because frankly, in many ways, that's the whole so what of our project, at least on the political activism side of things. But we'll save that for another day. I think that then also sets us up for kind of where we want to move now, which is more towards our vision of philosophical liberalism, why we even felt we needed it and needed to distinguish from the rest of the variants of liberalism that have existed in the past or that exist still today. And that speaks to our vision of freedom as kind of the foundation for human flourishing and greatness, as we will constantly refer to and have been talking about even since the first session when we opened here. So, we kind of broke this down into two outstanding questions that we left open or previewed last session and last discussion, which was, why is freedom a necessary precondition or foundational to a life of flourishing and greatness? And then how freedom is both a means and an end to the same. So I guess, Joy, you want to say anything on the first one?
Were we going to read something from the statement here, or did
Yeah,
you
I
want to
guess you know
just?
what. Yeah, that's fair. So, because I mean, we spent so much time on that we can always go back to that to refer to what we really mean here, and actually, the opening of our Article 2 does actually address both of these 2 points implicitly. And the reason Joy and I even called these 2 points out as something worthy of further discussion in these sessions was because we felt that we wanted to make these points explicit. So I'll just read the opening from that part of our statement, and then we can go from there. So we wrote, this had to do with the moral applications of philosophical liberalism. Through the freedom to continuously actualize on our potential, human beings can achieve a noble ideal, a self-chosen life focused on growth and the development of a virtuous character. Autonomy is key. Ultimately, the freedom to think and to act is required to thrive as human beings. Significantly, freedom is both a necessary precondition, a means, and an ultimate reward, an end of a flourishing life. We go on to some other parts, but I'll just pause there and see if you want to pick up from that on this first question of why freedom is foundational to flourishing and greatness.
Yeah. So let's start with autonomy is key. That I think this is even something that recent modern psychology, especially humanistic psychology, has started to recognize, that autonomy is key to how we live thriving, flourishing lives as individuals, and that when we have a society of autonomous individuals that are working in collaboration and cooperation with each other, that this is how we create a society that thrives. And we talked about that. We're trying to put in place principles that will lead to a good society, a flourishing society, but that it's also important to you and me that this is not only a good society, but a society that serves as a foundation for greatness, to bring out the potential greatness in all of the individuals that make up the society. And so here there is this idea that freedom is a certain bedrock. And of course, it's not anarchism, it is freedom with structure or so like right now people probably know I'm raising a toddler, and I love the Montessori approach even to thinking about early childhood development, which lends into thinking about what is it that makes a thriving human life. And Montessorians have this idea of freedom within limits and freedom within structure, and so there's this recognition that you need a certain amount of structure in place, but that the goal is to provide, in Montessori, is an environment in which the individual child has that ability to develop mastery and that sense of agency and autonomy, and that these are kind of ends in themselves into how we thrive as human beings.
I love that. And certainly that's a great experience that you're getting, kind of watching and raising your child and kind of seeing, providing a living laboratory, if you will, of these principles in action, in which every parent out there, almost the whole of humanity can relate to as well. Kind of every household in a way is its own, is kind of the smallest social unit out there, right? In which these principles still apply. I guess the
And we
way
have
I,
this great, oh, sorry, I was going to
oh,
just add
yeah.
just a quick interjection to say that we have this great phrase that we use that is like, help me to do it myself. So sometimes like,
Mm,
that's how I think about my role as a parent is there's certain things that my 2-year-old cannot do yet, but my role is to make it easier and easier for him to be able to do things himself. And ideally, that's what I want for all human beings, that by time he is an adult and for the other adults of the world, that that every adult is able to have that sense of autonomy.
I love that. Yeah, and the way I think about this one, the foundational part, we talked at the outset of this series and why we even emphasize it throughout our statement that our three cardinal values are freedom, flourishing, and greatness. And I kind of see them as linked in a chain, and even kind of, and that chain, well, a chain or maybe even a hierarchy, a pyramid might even be the better metaphor here. And given my background is in architecture and real estate, that's probably doubly appropriate. I don't know why you don't use those analogies and metaphors more, frankly, but whatever. um, in that each one also speaks to the higher level of human existence that we can reach. That we just talked about how freedom is the necessary precondition for humans given our nature. And so, and when we talk then about what it takes to live a flourishing life, you can think of that as achieving happiness. And we're going to get into what do we mean by flourishing and all that that encompasses is. But, you know, a good stand-in for that most people would be familiar with is the pursuit of happiness as it was immortalized in the American Declaration of Independence. And living that kind of life isn't possible without freedom. And so that's, it's foundational to get to that level. And then when we talk about what does it mean to live a life of greatness, which, to us means tapping into and maximizing your full human potential, which we will elaborate on much more so in the sessions to come. That is an even higher level of existence, which also further depends on freedom. So in that sense and in this structure, it truly is the foundational first step and condition upon which these higher levels of existence depend. And this is not just, I think, a didactic point. It's what this is all about, what all of liberalism, but especially philosophical liberalism, is all about, is helping us to see that we're not just, you know, another mammal looking to survive in the world, in nature. We as human beings have the unique capacity, because of all of these amazing dualities of character and identity and just ability that we possess. We have the unique position and privilege of being able to achieve a flourishing life, of experiencing happiness, and even of achieving, kind of this higher state of greatness of continuous betterment and continual character development, knowledge, growth, creative capacity, and expansion, all of which, kind of are uniquely human phenomenon. and experiences open to us, but which are not possible to tap into without in an environment of freedom. So that is just how I think about this one.
I love that statement. I'll add just one more on this part and then we can get to the next, which is I think about some of what are the seeds of freedom. And there could be a whole philosophical discussion about free will that I don't think we're going to get into because I think part of even the beauty of our statement is that we allow for perhaps multiple conceptions of what someone might think of as free will that would fall under our umbrella. But when I think about what freedom is in a basic sense, like what are the basic freedoms that you have as an individual within a society, I always think about it in terms of your physical energy and your attentions. In a sense, body and mind, although of course those are always related as well. You could think of your attention as just another form of the energy that emanates from your physical body, of course. But I love how this idea even I think connects back with ancient wisdom traditions. If you look back at ancient martial arts, kind of recognize that there is this sort of point about having to manage both your bodily energy and then also the energy of your attention. And this is really with that. That's where you have that capacity to exercise your freedom. And there's a great phrase that I love from martial arts that says that if the body is weak, you start by training the mind, getting the mind even stronger, work to the body to catch up, and
Mm,
then vice versa. That if it's the mind that's weak, you can start with like physically exercising the body, and then
mm,
work to
hmm
build up your attention. But to me, these are the seeds of where our freedom lies, and then from those seeds, we can start to develop out into beautiful flourishing of a multiplicity of freedoms that can find expression within the world.
hmm And which we noted all the different variations and manifestations of freedom, certainly in a modern life like ours, in the last discussion. So I think that ties well to that. And then I think that also leads us into the second question or kind of point on freedom that we really like to emphasize, and which I read just a minute ago, where we said significantly, freedom is both a necessary precondition or a means and an ultimate reward, an end of a flourishing human life. And I have to admit that even though I co-authored this statement and we chewed on it a lot, like it was still not one that fully sunk in with me. And so I made a point to want to dive into this one more. And so I'm glad we're doing this up here in the front end of our session. So Joya, you want to kind of start off with maybe your thoughts on this one, what we mean by freedom is both a means and an end in itself.
Well, maybe I had a head start on you on this one because I started my entrepreneurial journey a little before you did. And to me, at least, the meaning of this statement to me became clear from what it is to be an entrepreneur and the way that I think about the entrepreneurial journey. That, in a sense, freedom is, as an entrepreneur, the foundation of what makes it possible, but it's also the ultimate goal. And there's this sort of beautiful spiraling effect, I think, when you get it right. That it starts with that initial stages of freedom to pursue your own course, to take your own risks, to to try to build something into the world. And of course, as anybody who's tried to build a business knows that it involves a whole lot of taking on responsibility that, oftentimes people say, like, I want to leave a horrible boss and then they find out that they are like the worst boss that they ever had. So there's a lot of oftentimes internal work that has to be done so that you become the best boss for yourself, which even lends to this discussion of why freedom doesn't necessarily just mean anarchy, but you have to put proper
hmm
structures in place. But there's a way in which, right, so there's that little bit of freedom that grows and expands, and then the ultimate reward is just this greater sense of freedom. That's what we're after, and what we get when we are successful entrepreneurs is this experience of thriving in our own self sovereignty and thriving in our own self creation.
Yeah, I mean it's very so wonderfully put. It's it's very abstract. It's almost a little hard to convey until you really kind of stop and chew on it, which I had to a lot. But I think you hit on it, which is that the process of continuous betterment or self-actualization, as others might refer to it, but of constantly pushing yourself to be more, to do more, to live, to learn and understand more. That whole process, which is a never-ending process, because we can never be, as we've noted many times already, we can never be omniscient and kind of all knowing and all powerful. And I don't think that's anyone's ideal anyways, but just even living a life in which you are constantly striving to improve on all dimensions, that process in and of itself is a liberating process. And so it is a form of freedom, because it's the ultimate form of self-expression, and self-actualization. It's kind of in the name. It's kind of, I think that's a good way to just to put this. And I kind of said it's the human equivalent of soaring on eagle's wings, high, lofty, and free over all the earth and beyond, in a never-ending process of living life to its fullest and maximizing your own potential, all of which are radical acts of freedom in and of themselves. So, that to me is the end goal, is that, ironically, the end goal is constant action and thought and development, but that is inherently a process that can only be done through freedom.
Exactly. The end goal is not a thing or a place or a state. It is an activity. As Aristotle recognized, happiness, the category that it belongs to, is activity, and that it is just this wonderful free sense of activity. I love how you describe it as radical acts of freedom, and that's what we're after.
And we wouldn't be complete in a discussion on freedom without noting that we actually did define freedom in our own terms
Mhm.
in our statement. Is separate from how we kind of opened this two-part session in the last discussion about freedom, kind of at the broadest, highest general emotional level. But now here are putting it into our terms in context of philosophical liberalism and what we're after for flourishing and greatness, as well as in a political, structure of society context. We said, actually, it's the next sentence in the Article 2 opener that I read just a minute ago. We said, in essence, freedom is living independently, interdependently, with responsibility. So, Joya, I know you actually took the lead on authoring that one. So, anything you'd like to add on that point?
I think everything that we've said leading up to this just leads up to that statement. So I think it is the perfect conclusion that it captures this idea that we are both individual, that we are social, that our our life is activity that ought to be free, but that freedom isn't an anarchy, but one that reaches its full potential through the self-chosen responsibilities that we take in alignment with reality and our nature as human beings, and then how we thrive.
And in uh, alignment and cooperation with others. And I think that's the
Exactly.
interdependently point.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. Wonderfully put. So, um, I didn't have anything else on this topic, and that did cover at least the 3 points that we said we wanted to cover last discussion. So, do you have anything else you want to add or thought we missed?
I think that was a beautiful summation. So why don't we even just leave it with our call to action to the audience this time?
Perfect. Yeah. So for this one, and picking up on everything we just discussed, we thought it would be good to start kind of applying these ideas to the real world, to our own lives, especially since we are action oriented ultimately, and that's what we're about here at 1776 Forward. So we had the idea to identify one area in your own life where perhaps you feel constricted or constrained, or maybe even you don't feel, but you are legally, politically, or otherwise, but where you know that having greater freedom would lead to more flourishing and you're being able to achieve more potential in this area. It could be your career, it could be your economic or creative endeavors, it could be politically, whatever the domain is, but maybe identify one area and then imagine one path of action or one action item that you could take or that could be taken to free it up a little more and to unleash that greater action and freedom of action in that area. That we would love to hear your thoughts, or even just share them with us privately. You could DM us, comment on the Substack, send us an email, however you want to. But let's start thinking through some areas where we can start expanding our realm of freedom.
And then we'll get on next session on to flourishing. I'm excited for that one.
Yes, finally starting to, we've been throwing out these two terms of flourishing and greatness for a while here. So as you can see, we're building up here, but,
Yes. The
we're doing,
skyscraper is growing, Chris.
yeah, it is exactly. So I look forward to that one, next week. So.